So we're talking about whether the road to Civil War time period, how were these different events democratic or more or less democratic? What your goal is to select which one you think it is. Is it more democratic or is it less democratic? A lot of these events can be interpreted in different ways. It's how you argue that's important. So, for example, Nat Turner, you could argue that it might be democratic, meaning he tried to, the people that haven't had any power were trying to get the power and free themselves. You could argue that it's not democratic because generally we consider targeting people and killing them, whether they were actually part of this a slave owner or not, would maybe not be so democratic. They obviously didn't get a say in it, but that part of democracy where people are asserting their power, and a lot of people debate whether violence can be democratic or not. The Missouri Compromise, it kept kind of the peace between the Southerners and the Northerners. People had a balance of power, so you could argue that that was democratic. You could also argue it wasn't democratic because, any time that you're continuing to allow slavery, that's not necessarily democratic. Oh, and the last thing about Nat Turner, you could also argue that it wasn't democratic because the Southerners' response, certainly to Nat Turner, wasn't very democratic to go on a random killing spree. In terms of the Compromise of 1850, you could argue that the Compromise of 1850 was democratic because, again, there was a balance and people had power, and we tried to compromise. There was a voting process involved in Congress. You could definitely argue that it's not democratic because, again, California, quote, quote, became a free state, although they continued the practice of enslaving original Americans. And the stronger fugitive slave law is probably questionably democratic, allowing people in the territories to vote in the New Mexican territories and what would become Arizona. That would be considered democratic. And but the fugitive slave law is not necessarily very democratic. It takes away the Fourth Amendment rights for people to search any home. It jails anybody who is trying to help runaways. The enslaved people or people that are in question or being captured do not have the rights to testify in court. So their rights of the Sixth and Fifth Amendments to have a fair trial have been taken away. The Fourth Amendment, which says that you have to have a search warrant in order to enter people's homes, and that was taken away for the Northerners. Everybody had to help catch runaways. Those are things that are taking away power and options and choice from people. Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's not really, you can argue that one of the things that maybe makes it democratic is that it's trying to raise the voice of those who don't have the option of writing books. So she's trying to illustrate and trying to convert people to end a very undemocratic institution, slavery. And she's trying to get people to really feel the emotional impact and have that desire and question the institution of slavery. And so it could be considered as a democratic act or intention in that way, in the way of trying to lift up the people and give somebody a voice who doesn't have a voice. For Kansas-Nebraska Act, it was democratic because people got to vote in those states on whether to allow slavery or not. However, the violence that occurred and the illegal voting was not democratic. The democratic process means you register to vote in a state and you claim residency and you vote in only one state. It's definitely not a democratic election if people are cheating in the election. And so the actions of the Missouri bushwhackers coming over and voting in Kansas and then leaving, the idea that then immigrants also did the same thing from the northern states, came in and voted and then left, those things are not actions of democracy. The violent outbreaks weren't necessarily democratic. Threatening people to withhold the vote isn't democratic either. So there is parts of the actual act, the law that was passed was democratic right here, but Bleeding Kansas, what happened between the Kansas-Nebraska Act's passing and also leading up to Bleeding Kansas and the entire of Bleeding Kansas was not necessarily democratic. I mean, the only thing democratic about it was that everybody was kind of on both sides, targeted, and people were going at each other. But it wasn't always, intentional how people targeted people. So there's a lot of question whether it was democratic or not, and probably not so much democracy. The Dred Scott decision, which ruled that Dred Scott was at the Supreme Court level, not only that Dred Scott himself was not allowed to testify and assert his rights as in the Missouri, under the Missouri law, that once you were taken to a free state, you would always be free. But Justice Taney ruled that all African Americans were not citizens of the United States and didn't have any rights. That certainly takes away power, denies people citizenship, and that would generally be something that is not necessarily democratic because they're denying a whole group of people their rights under our Constitution that were born in the United States. So that is not really something that would be considered a democratic act. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which we have studied a lot in this class, is very debatable. That one, again, you could argue either way, just like Nat Turner. You can really look at it from he's trying to help the oppressed. He's trying to give power to those who do not have power in our country, to try to slowly end the institution that is or the practice of slavery, which is very undemocratic. But you also can argue that John Brown's raid to attack a U.S. government arsenal is not democratic. It's not how you go about trying to make change, and certainly, that's illegal. And those are the events that will be covered on the Road to War test, open note test. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to pick a side, whether you think, what the rule is. You have to pick either it was more or it wasn't democratic. You can acknowledge the other side. So if you pick, for example, that it was more democratic during this time period, the Navy westward expansion time period, you might highlight things like parts of the Compromise of 1850, the Missouri Compromise, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then you would acknowledge that some things were a little bit democratic. You might also, if you're going to say if it's not democratic, you might mention things like the Southerners' response to Nat Turner, the things about the Missouri Compromise, the negative aspects or parts of the Missouri Compromise, that, the Compromise of 1850 had some negative aspects, the fugitive slave laws, undemocratic parts. You can argue that even though Uncle Tom's Cabin was passed, slavery didn't change. You could argue about Bleeding Kansas. You could argue about Dred Scott, and you could argue parts of the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. But you could use John Brown's Harper's Ferry on either side. You've got to decide. So one thing I would recommend, if you didn't get to finish it in class, is go through and fill out each of these boxes. Maybe make little T-charts if it's split or just kind of the ones that are not split, then just answer how it was or it wasn't. And then decide which ones do you feel like you can argue easier. Is it, more democratic than westward expansion? Have we progressed in our country by 1860 than we were doing when we were talking about the 1848 and 1850s and westward expansion? Or, is there a little bit more that you could argue that our country was making that progress towards democracy now that you know more information about these events? Or could you say that our country really hasn't changed much, and that we really at the brink of 1860 haven't progressed that much, and here are all the reasons why we really haven't progressed much farther than significantly farther than westward expansion. So you're kind of arguing whether it's a little bit more democratic or is it about the same, and then using these events to support your answer. And it's how you support your answer. It's which ones you pick that are more democratic and less. And acknowledging, even if you say that it's a little bit more democratic, you need to acknowledge that some of these events weren't so democratic, that it's not a giant leap forward. Slavery still exists in 1860, and that we enter a period where our country is splitting apart, and the Southerners are doing all that they can to hang on to this institution. So you're not arguing that it was a giant leap forward. You're arguing that it was a little leap forward or that it wasn't a leap forward at all. And those are really important distinctions. And it's also just really important that you think about which ones are going to go in which column. Another thing you might do is then, after organizing these events, make a T-chart down here that says the more democratic ones, the less democratic ones, and then kind of circle your side and then say, okay, like this is how I'm going to argue for which one am I going to argue for, and be ready for that argument, and be ready and prepared and know which side that you are going to pick on Monday. And you can use the notes that you have written and that are in your handwriting. So I don't want anything typed. I don't want anything from, but it can be from your handwriting.